A president is taken, not defeated in war, not removed by his own people, but seized, extracted, flown out, and put on trial by another country. That single act changes everything. Because when a superpower decides it can arrest a foreign leader by force, the world quietly crosses a line it can never uncross. Many people cheered. Some called it justice. Others called it revenge. But almost no one asked the most dangerous question of all. If this is legal, who decides next? This is not just about Nicolás Maduro. This is about the rules that keep powerful nations from doing whatever they want. And what happens when those rules are bent, stretched, and finally ignored? History has seen this moment before. Different country, different decade. Same logic. Panama. Manuel Noriega. If you think this story is about one man in Venezuela, you are already missing the point. This is about how power learns to wear the mask of law. Stay with me, because once you see the mechanism, you will never look at justice the same way again. And to understand how we got here, we have to step back carefully to where this argument first took shape. What exactly is the problem here? On the surface, it sounds simple. A leader is accused of crimes, serious crimes, drug trafficking, corruption, undermining democracy. So the argument feels intuitive. If someone is a criminal, they should face justice. But international politics does not work like domestic law. States are not individuals. Leaders are not ordinary suspects. And borders are not just lines on a map. This is where the tension begins. International law was built on one fragile idea. Sovereignty matters. No state gets to police another by force simply because it feels morally right. That principle exists for a reason. Because once you allow power to decide guilt, legality becomes optional. The Maduro operation forces us to confront this contradiction. Criminal law versus international law. Justice versus stability. Moral outrage versus legal restraint. And beneath all of it sits an uncomfortable reality. The United States was not just enforcing law, it was redefining who gets to enforce it. To see how this logic became possible, we need to look backward. Not to Venezuela, but to the moment this framework was first tested. The roots of this logic go back decades, to a moment when the Cold War was ending, and America was redefining its role in the world. In the 1980 seconds, the enemy had a name. The Soviet Union intervention was justified as counterintervention. One superpower responding to another. But by the end of that decade, something changed. The old framework collapsed, and a new one quietly took its place. The problem was no longer ideology. It was disorder. Drug trafficking, authoritarian leaders, thugs in high places. This shift mattered because it removed the need for symmetry. No rival superpower, no external invasion to respond to. Now the justification was internal. A regime was illegitimate. A leader was criminal. A threat existed even without an army crossing borders. Law adapted to power, not the other way around. Legal memos began to stretch old rules. Criminal activity became a security threat. Self-defense became a flexible concept. What emerged was a new cycle. Political goals first, legal reasoning second. And once that door opened, it never fully closed. The first real test of this new doctrine came suddenly, violently, and on a small strip of land connecting two oceans. Everything accelerated in December 1989. 14,000 troops, one small country, one clear target, Manuel Noriega. Officially, the mission had 4 goals: protect American lives, restore democracy, defend the Panama Canal treaties, arrest a man under U.S. indictment. It sounded clean, precise, almost surgical. But look closer. Each justification leaned on the same elastic word. Self-defense, not against tanks, not against missiles, but against drugs, corruption, moral decay. Criminal activity was reframed as aggression. Law enforcement became military action. And an invasion was dressed in legal language. This mattered more than it seemed, because once force is justified this way, limits disappear. There was no extradition, no consent, no international mandate, only power, moving fast, deciding unilaterally. Many Americans felt relief. Confidence returned. The operation worked, but success can be misleading because it hides the cost. If you think this is where the story ends, pause here. What really changed was not Panama's government, it was the meaning of law itself. If this analysis is sharpening your perspective, stay with me. Because the most dangerous part was not the invasion, it was the logic behind it. And that logic did not stay visible for long. What was hidden beneath the spectacle was a mechanism, quiet, technical, and extremely powerful. International law offered clear paths: extradition, consent, cooperation between states. All of them failed in Noriega's case, because the person who had to approve extradition was the very man being accused. So a workaround was created. Legal memoranda argued something radical. That U.S. law enforcement, even the military, could seize suspects abroad without permission, even if customary international law objected. The justification was simple. Threat equals self-defense. Not an armed attack, not imminent violence, but danger, broadly defined. Drug trafficking was elevated, corruption was securitized. Democracy itself became something that could be defended by force. This inverted the legal order. Instead of law constraining power, power reinterpreted law. Political objectives came first. Legal principles were retrofitted afterward. Necessity blurred. Proportionality faded. Immediacy vanished entirely. Once the system is accepted, it becomes reusable, portable, applicable anywhere. The Noriega case was not an exception. It was a prototype, and once you recognize that, the next crisis becomes easier to predict, because the second time, the argument arrives faster, cleaner, with fewer doubts. The second crisis arrives quietly. No invasion this time, no tanks on television, no shock and awe, just a familiar argument. Reused, refined, criminal charges are announced, sweeping, narrated as existential threats. The language sounds legal, measured, almost calm, but the structure is the same. A leader is labeled a danger, not because of an armed attack, but because his actions are said to corrode security itself. Crime becomes war by another name. At this stage, the threshold is already gone. If drugs are aggression, if corruption is intervention, if democracy can be defended by force, then restraint becomes optional. This is the real escalation, not the operation, but the normalization. Each repetition makes the logic feel safer, more reasonable, less shocking, until one day no one asks whether it is legal at all. They only ask whether it works. And when that question replaces all others, the consequences no longer stay local. They travel, and they land on people who never voted for this system. Now let me bring this down to where it really lands. On you, because these doctrines are never abstract when they mature. They touch ordinary lives first. Quietly, indirectly, when power decides it can bypass rules for a greater good, it doesn't stop at foreign leaders. It changes how force is justified everywhere. You feel it when law becomes flexible, when fear replaces due process, when accusations travel faster than evidence. You feel it when security is used to excuse anything. Surveillance, sanctions, collective punishment. You are told it is necessary, that it is temporary, that it keeps you safe, but history teaches something colder. Once limits are removed at the top, protections weaken at the bottom. The same logic that crosses borders without consent also crosses moral lines without hesitation. And here is the uncomfortable truth. You do not need to support Maduro to be affected by this. You only need to live in a world where power is learning. It no longer has to explain itself. If this makes you uneasy, it should, because international law is not about protecting villains. It is about protecting everyone else from becoming collateral. If this perspective resonates, pause for a moment. Share it, because these conversations only matter if they spread. And now we need to zoom out, because once this logic is normalized, it doesn't stay national. It goes global. Once this logic goes global, it stops being theoretical. Other powers are watching closely, patiently. When a dominant state treats criminal accusations as grounds for force, rivals take notes, not to uphold law, but to reuse the script. The precedent is the real weapon. If sovereignty can be overridden by moral language, then borders everywhere become negotiable. If self-defense can be stretched to include crime, corruption, or influence, then almost anything qualifies. This is how norms collapse. Not with explosions, but with imitation. Russia sees it, China sees it, and they understand the opportunity. The argument will sound familiar. Threats to stability, threats to security, threats to the nation, different targets, same structure. And once multiple powers claim the same right, no one can enforce restraint. Because the rule was never written clearly enough to stop them, this is the dangerous symmetry. What begins as exceptional behavior by one actor becomes permission for all. International law does not die loudly. It erodes, case by case, precedent by precedent, and once erosion sets in, the future narrows. Which brings us to the only question that matters now. Where does this road actually lead? There are only three paths forward. None of them are abstract. First scenario, the logic is restrained, rarely used, tightly justified. Force remains exceptional. Self-defense returns to its limits. Necessity, proportionality, immediacy. This path preserves the system, barely. But it requires discipline from the most powerful actors. And history tells us how rare that is. Second scenario, the one we are already drifting into, selective enforcement, rules applied unevenly, friends protected, enemies targeted. International law survives in language, not practice. It becomes rhetorical, a tool of persuasion, not restraint. Order exists, but it is thin, fragile, dependent on power balances, not principles. Third scenario, the darkest one, the precedent hardens, normalizes, spreads. Major powers openly seize, strike, or remove leaders they label threats, each claiming legality, each citing earlier cases. In this world, law does not constrain force. It follows it, and once that happens, the system no longer prevents conflict. It accelerates it. History is unforgiving here. Norms either hold or they vanish. There is no middle ground for long. And that brings us to the final question. Not about Maduro, not about Noriega, but about what kind of world we are choosing to normalize. This story does not end with one arrest. It ends with a choice. Every era reveals what it truly believes when it feels threatened, not by what it says, but by what it allows. The capture of a foreign leader is easy to frame as justice, as moral clarity, as strength, but systems are judged by their limits, not their intentions. International law was never designed to protect bad men. It was designed to restrain powerful ones, especially when they are certain they are right. Once power learns it can bypass rules and still claim legitimacy, something irreversible happens. Force stops asking permission. Law stops setting boundaries. And the danger is not chaos tomorrow. It is confidence today, confidence that this time is different, that this case is exceptional, that our motives are pure. History is littered with systems that collapsed that way. If you want a stable world, you cannot build it on shortcuts. If you want justice, you cannot redefine it every time power is impatient. This is not about defending a leader. It is about defending a rule. If this analysis changed how you see global power, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, discuss it, challenge it, because the precedents being set today are not waiting for history's verdict. They are writing it, and the next chapter has already begun.